Of the 220 men and women who spent the summer of 1954 building a fake Mongol empire in the Utah desert, 91 would go on to develop cancer. 46 of them would not survive it. Among the dead, the biggest movie star in America, the woman who beat him to the Oscar, and the director who put them both there. Today, every above-the-title name connected to the Conqueror is gone. The desert they filmed in is quiet again. But 60 miles away, the people who lived there the whole time, the ones nobody put under contract, are still telling their story. A new documentary just gave them a microphone. This is the story of the film that came before it. On screen, he was the man who never lost. He'd played soldiers, gunslingers, and now, astonishingly, Genghis Khan, in a casting decision so strange that even RKO's own marketing team struggled to sell it. Off-screen, John Wayne had never actually served in World War II. He sought and received deferments while many of his peers shipped out, and he carried a quiet defensiveness about it for the rest of his life, a gap between the uniform he wore on camera and the one he never wore for real. Wayne smoked 3 to 5 packs of cigarettes a day, a habit that started in the early 1930s and never really stopped. On location near St. George, Utah, he reportedly carried a Geiger counter onto the set just to see what the numbers looked like, and joked that the thing must be broken, it was clicking so fast. He had no idea at the time that he was standing 137 miles downwind of a nuclear test site, on ground that had absorbed fallout from 11 detonations the year before filming began. He kept working almost without pause for the next 2 decades, becoming the closest thing American cinema had to a national monument. In 1964, 10 years after The Conqueror wrapped, doctors found a tumor in his left lung. He had the lung and 2 ribs removed, survived, and called the experience the Big C in public, turning his own diagnosis into one of the first mainstream conversations about cancer survivorship in Hollywood.
She built her career playing women who'd been knocked down and refused to stay there. An alcoholic in Smash Up, a death row inmate in I Want to Live, the role that finally won her the Oscar after 4 prior nominations. Born Edith Merenner in Brooklyn, she'd reinvented herself so completely that almost nobody on set in Utah knew the redhead playing a Tartar princess had grown up nowhere near a horse. By the early 1970s, Hayward had quietly stepped back from Hollywood entirely, having remarried and moved to a 600-acre cattle ranch outside Carrollton, Georgia, where she raised prize Hereford bulls and fished from her own boats. Friends who visited her there barely recognized the tabloid version of her life. There was no entourage, just a woman who'd traded sound stages for pasture land. Her last theatrical film, fittingly, was called The Revengers, released in 1972, the same year doctors found a tumor that would not go away. She was diagnosed with brain cancer in 1972 and fought it for 3 years, dying at her home on March 14, 1975, at 57. She was buried in Carrollton, beside the husband she'd lost 9 years earlier, the small Georgia town she'd quietly adopted as home, a long way from both Brooklyn and the Utah desert that may have started it all.
The actress famous for playing women who clawed their way back from disaster spent her real final years exactly where she wanted to be, on a ranch, with cattle, fishing, before a disease with no regard for scripts wrote her an ending she never auditioned for. Which of these stories has hit you hardest so far? Tell me in the comments. There's still more. Audiences would eventually know her as Endora, the imperious, sharp-tongued witch on Bewitched, a decade after The Conqueror, and a role she almost turned down. In real life, Moorehead was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, college-educated with a master's degree in English, and known on every set she worked for keeping a Bible close by. Long before her diagnosis, Moorehead had already heard the rumors swirling about the Conqueror's Utah location, stories of radioactive germs in the ground. A close friend later recalled her saying, flatly, that everyone in that picture seemed to be getting cancer and dying. When her own diagnosis came, she reportedly told someone close to her she should never have taken the part. She kept working in radio almost until the very end, a medium she'd loved since the 1940s, when her performance in Sorry, Wrong Number became one of the most celebrated dramatic broadcasts in American radio history. In early 1974, only months before her death, she still found time to record an episode of the CBS Radio Mystery Theater. Diagnosed with uterine cancer in 1972, Moorehead died on April 30th, 1974, at a hospital in Rochester, Minnesota, at age 73. True to a life spent guarding her privacy, she asked that details of her death not be released. She's interred at Dayton Memorial Park in Ohio, on land her own family had farmed for generations. The witch with the cutting one-liners and the arched eyebrow was, in life, a quiet, devout woman who carried scripture onto sets full of fake Mongol war drums, and who saw her own ending coming long before anyone else wanted to believe it.
Before Hollywood ever cast him as Genghis Khan's loyal friend Jamuga, Armendariz was already one of the biggest stars in Mexican cinema, a leading man in the golden age of Mexico City filmmaking who'd worked with directors like Emilio Fernandez on classics still studied today. To American audiences who only knew him from supporting roles, he was a reliable character actor. To Mexico, he was a legend who happened to also work in English. Years after The Conqueror, Armendariz began suffering pain in his hip, pain that doctors eventually traced to cancer. He was cast in From Russia with Love, the second James Bond film, and made the decision to keep working anyway, limping visibly through nearly every scene, determined to leave his family financially secure before he was gone. By the end of filming, he could no longer physically perform, and his final scenes were completed using a stand-in. The film was released 4 months after his death, his last performance given almost entirely in pain on behalf of people he wouldn't get to see grow up. Told his cancer was terminal at UCLA Medical Center in June 1963, Armendariz chose not to wait for the disease to finish what it started. He died there on June 18, 1963, at 51 years old, and was returned home to be buried at Pantheon Jardín in Mexico City. He played the loyal second-in-command who stood beside a conqueror until the very end. In real life, he was the one who decided exactly when his own ending would come, on his own terms, for the people he loved. If this is bringing up anything heavy for you, you're not alone in that, and it's okay to step away from the screen for a minute. He'd started as a boyish crooner in 1930s musicals, all dimples and high notes. By the time he directed The Conqueror, Powell had reinvented himself as a hard-edged dramatic actor and increasingly a serious filmmaker and television executive, co-founding 4-Star Television and building one of the era's most respected production companies. Powell knew, by most accounts, that the U.S. government had detonated nuclear weapons near the film's Utah location the year before shooting began. The Atomic Energy Commission assured everyone involved that the area was safe. Powell believed them, or chose to, and brought his cast and crew into the Escalante Desert anyway. He largely stepped away from acting in the mid-1950s to focus on producing and directing television, eventually hosting his own anthology series, The Dick Powell Show. He kept working until just months before his death. Diagnosed with cancer of the chest in late 1962, Powell died on January 2, 1963. His wife, actress June Allison, at his side after a 4-month battle. He was 58. He was cremated and placed in the Columbarium of Honor at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. The humanizing detail. The man who once sang "I Only Have Eyes for You" in a 1930s musical spent his final film as a director leading the people he was responsible for into ground that would outlive most of them in damage, a tune with a much darker echo than anyone could have known. He never appeared on screen, but no one in this story carries more weight than the man who financed it. Howard Hughes produced The Conqueror, and by most accounts was the one person on the project who fully understood what nuclear fallout could do, having spent years immersed in aviation and defense-adjacent industries where radiation exposure was already a known hazard. When filming wrapped, Hughes had 60 tons of contaminated desert soil shipped back to a Hollywood soundstage so the interior reshoots would visually match the location footage. He likely never knew that decision alone may have multiplied the exposure for everyone working those reshoot days. As cast members began dying through the 1960s and 70s, Hughes reportedly grew consumed with guilt. He spent millions buying up every available copy of the film, pulling it from circulation, and in his increasingly reclusive final years, watched it alone, night after night, until his death in 1976. He is the closest thing this story has to a man haunted by his own movie. The Conqueror was shot in the Red Canyons outside St. George, Utah. Land the cast thought was just a dramatic backdrop for a Mongol epic. It was, in fact, sitting downwind of one of the most consequential decisions of the Cold War. The people in front of the camera carried that decision home with them into hospitals and cemeteries scattered from Newport Beach to Carrollton, Georgia, to Mexico City, to a quiet farm cemetery in Dayton, Ohio. For decades, their deaths were treated as Hollywood trivia, a spooky footnote, a curse for late-night TV specials. But the people who actually lived in St. George, who never got a studio contract or a stand-in or a UCLA hospital room, were never trivia. They were the original downwinders, and many are still alive, still fighting for the country to fully acknowledge what was done to their home. A recent documentary finally gave many of them a national stage, and in 2025, lawmakers moved to expand compensation for exactly the kind of harm their community has lived with for 70 years. The desert outside St. George is calm again. The film's stars rest in 5 different states and 1 foreign country, but the ground itself remembers what the cameras never showed. Which part of this story do you think deserves more attention, the cast or the community that still live in the aftermath? Let me know below.